Deep in the Amazon rainforest, where satellite signals die and civilization becomes a distant memory, Maya Restrepo stood before a bamboo hut that legally belonged to her, and wished it didn't. Her husband, Carlos, had been dead for 3 months, but the jungle around his secret hideaway pulsed with an unnatural energy that made her skin crawl. Inside the hut, she expected to find his research notes about medicinal plants, maybe some personal effects that would help her understand why he'd spent half their marriage disappearing into this green hell. Instead, she found steel cages, surgical equipment, and vials of something that glowed faintly in the darkness. Maya wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a former military bioweapons specialist who'd walked away from that life to marry a botanist and start fresh. Now, as inhuman sounds echoed through the trees and something large moved in the shadows beyond the hut, she realized Carlos hadn't been studying plants at all. He'd been creating something that was now loose in the jungle. But what happens when a predator becomes the prey and the hunter realizes she's been marked for elimination? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya's hands trembled as she lifted one of the vials, its contents casting an eerie blue-green light across her weathered face. The liquid inside moved with an almost sentient quality, swirling in patterns that defied physics. She'd seen bioluminescent compounds before during her years at Fort Detrick, but nothing quite like this. The glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with something she couldn't identify, almost like a heartbeat. The bamboo walls creaked around her, and she noticed scratches gouged deep into the wood. Something had clawed at the walls from the inside. The cages, she realized with growing horror, hadn't been built to keep specimens contained. They'd been torn open from within. A low growling sound drifted through the humid air, too deep to be any jaguar she knew. Maya set the vial down carefully and reached for the Glock 19 holstered beneath her khaki vest. 15 years of marriage to Carlos had softened her edges, but muscle memory never truly dies. Her finger found the trigger guard as she stepped toward the hut's entrance. The jungle had fallen unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no insect chatter, no rustling of small creatures through the undergrowth. Even the constant drip of condensation from the canopy seemed muted. This wasn't normal predator silence. This was something else entirely. Maya's eyes adjusted to the fading daylight as she scanned the tree line. The guide who'd brought her here, a weathered local named Joaquin, had refused to wait. He'd taken one look at the hut and crossed himself before disappearing back down the barely visible trail. "Lugar maldito," he'd whispered. "Cursed place." She'd thought he was just being superstitious. Now she understood his fear. A branch snapped somewhere to her left, followed by a sound that made her blood freeze. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. Maya pivoted toward the sound, weapon raised, and caught a glimpse of movement between the massive cecropia trees. Whatever it was big. Too big to be moving that quietly through dense jungle. Maya backed toward the hut, keeping her gun trained on the shadows. Her mind raced through possibilities, cataloging what she'd seen inside. The surgical equipment was military-grade, far beyond anything a botanist would need. The computer system looked like something from a Level 4 biosafety lab, and those vials, she'd counted at least 20, all empty except for residual traces of that glowing substance. Carlos had been conducting experiments out here for years, completely off the books. But experiments on what? A memory surfaced unbidden. Carlos returning from one of his research trips 18 months ago, his clothes torn and a deep gash across his forearm that he'd claimed came from a fall. He'd been different after that trip, distant, secretive, and he'd started asking strange questions about her old work, about genetic modification protocols and containment procedures. The dragging sound grew closer, accompanied now by a rhythmic clicking that reminded Maya of insect mandibles, but amplified 100 times over. She pressed her back against the hut's entrance and tried to control her breathing. Whatever Carlos had created Whatever he'd been feeding with that glowing compound, it was still here, still hungry. Maya's satellite phone was useless, this deep in the jungle, and the nearest village was a 2-day hike through terrain she barely knew. Joaquin had the only boat, and he was long gone. She was alone with Carlos's creation, armed with limited ammunition and fading daylight. The clicking stopped abruptly, plunging the jungle into complete silence. Maya held her breath, finger hovering over the trigger as something vast and impossible emerged from the shadows between the trees. In the dying light, she caught glimpses of chitinous plates, multiple limbs and eyes that reflected her terror back at her with an intelligence that shouldn't exist. Carlos hadn't just been playing God in this jungle laboratory. He'd succeeded, and now his creation was coming home. The sound started just after midnight, a rhythmic tapping that pulled Maya from the edge of sleep. She lay frozen on the narrow cot, listening to the deliberate percussion against the wooden walls. Tap, tap, tap. 3 beats, then silence. 3 beats again. She reached for the flashlight beside her pillow, her fingers trembling as she clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the sparse furnishings of David's hut. The tapping stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making it sensed the light. Maya waited, barely breathing. Minutes crawled by in absolute silence before she finally lowered the flashlight and closed her eyes. Just as sleep began to claim her again, the sound resumed, this time from a different wall. When dawn finally crept through the windows, she found herself examining the exterior of the hut. The wood showed no signs of damage, no claw marks or impact points that might explain the nocturnal disturbance. But as she rounded the back corner, something made her stop short. Footprints, not human, too wide, with an odd distribution of weight that suggested something moving on all fours but far larger than any animal she could identify. The prints led from the jungle's edge to the laboratory wall, where they circled the building twice before disappearing back into the undergrowth. Maya knelt beside the clearest impression, her anthropologist's training kicking in despite her fear. The print was roughly the size of a dinner plate, with what appeared to be 5 distinct digits, but the proportions were wrong, elongated in ways that made her skin crawl. She pulled out her phone to photograph them, but the camera refused to focus properly, producing only blurred images that revealed nothing. The satellite phone David had left in the hut offered her only hope of communication with the outside world. She tried calling her sister in Portland, then her colleague at the university, but each attempt met with the same result: static that gradually morphed into something that almost sounded like breathing. Frustrated and increasingly unnerved, Maya decided to explore the laboratory more thoroughly in daylight. The hidden room felt different now, the shadows deeper despite the morning sun filtering through the canopy above. The specimens in their jars seemed to watch her as she moved between the tables, their preserved forms somehow more grotesque than they had appeared the day before. She began photographing everything, the journals, the equipment, the specimens. But like the footprints outside, the images came out distorted, as if something in the room itself resisted documentation. The few clear shots she managed revealed details that made her stomach turn: surgical scars on the preserved creatures, metal implants that glinted in their flesh, modifications that spoke of deliberate intervention rather than natural mutation. In David's journal, she found entries that grew increasingly erratic as the dates progressed. His handwriting, normally precise and controlled, became jagged and urgent. Day 127, the enzyme is working faster than anticipated. Subject 3 showed cognitive enhancement beyond projected parameters. Need to adjust dosage. Day 143, they're learning. God help me, they're actually learning. The way Subject 3 looks at me now, there's intelligence there, awareness. Day 156 had to terminate Subject 3. It was trying to communicate. The sounds it made, almost like words. Maya can never know about this. Day 162, I think they're calling to others. Every night there are sounds in the jungle, Responses. I've made a terrible mistake. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks before David's supposed death. They're not just in the lab anymore. I see eyes in the darkness, watching the hut, waiting. The experiment has gone beyond my control. If something happens to me, the lab must be destroyed. The research cannot continue. Maya, if you ever read this, run. Don't try to understand. Just run. Maya's hands shook as she set down the journal. The implications crashed over her in waves. David hadn't died in an accident. He'd been killed by his own creations. A new sound made her look up. Through the laboratory's single window, she could see movement in the jungle canopy. Branches swayed without wind, and shadows shifted between the trees with purpose rather than randomness. Something large was moving through the upper reaches of the forest, staying just out of direct sight. The movement stopped directly above the laboratory. Maya held her breath as debris began to rain down, leaves, small twigs, and then something else. A viscous dark fluid that struck the window with soft, wet impacts. As it slid down the glass, she caught sight of its source. Eyes. Intelligent alien eyes that reflected the filtered sunlight with an inner awareness that no jungle animal should possess. They watched her for a long moment, and in that gaze, she saw recognition. Whatever was up there knew exactly who she was. The eyes disappeared, but Maya remained frozen, understanding with crystalline clarity that she was no longer the observer in this place. She had become the observed. The screaming started at dawn. Maya jolted upright in the narrow cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound cut through the jungle's morning chorus like a blade, high-pitched, almost human, but wrong in every way that mattered. It lasted only seconds before dissolving into the humid air, leaving her to wonder if exhaustion had finally broken her mind. She'd barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call had sent her bolt upright, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The laboratory below seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, even through the floorboards, and David's journal lay open beside her, its cramped handwriting swimming with impossible claims. Day 847. The specimens are responding beyond all projections. Neural activity has increased 340% since introduction of the hybrid serum. Dr. Vasquez warns we're moving too fast, but the potential. Day 851. Lost contact with the village. Investigating reports of changed animals in Sector 7. The locals speak of spirits, but we know better. We know what we've created. Maya forced herself to stand, legs trembling. Through the window, the jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, a green maze that had swallowed her husband's secrets whole. She needed answers, but first she needed coffee and the illusion of normalcy. The small camping stove sputtered to life, and she set water to boil with shaking hands. David's journal beckoned from the cot, filled with dates spanning 3 years. 3 years of lies. While she'd believed he was photographing rare birds and documenting indigenous plant species, he'd been playing God with things that had no names. The coffee was bitter, grounds floating like tiny insects in the murky liquid. She forced herself to drink it anyway, needing the caffeine more than taste. Outside, the jungle had grown oddly quiet. Even the ever-present drone of insects had faded to an uncomfortable whisper. Maya flipped through more journal entries, each one darker than the last. References to Project Chimera appeared frequently, along with coordinates for various test sites. A loose photograph fell from between the pages, David standing beside a massive tree whose bark seemed to writhe and pulse with veins of sickly yellow light. He was smiling. She'd never seen him smile like that before, triumphant, hungry. A soft thud against the outer wall made her freeze. Then another. Something was moving around the hut's perimeter with deliberate stealth. Maya crept to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. At first, she saw nothing but green shadows. Then movement caught her eye, something pale sliding between the trees. It might have been a snake, but snakes didn't grow that thick or move with such purposeful intelligence. As she watched, a section of it reared up, revealing what might have been a head, or heads. The distance made it impossible to tell. The thing turned toward the hut, and Maya jerked back from the window. Her coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor. The sound seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. When she dared to look again, the creature was gone. Her hands shook as she gathered the journal and David's research notes. She couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was circling the hut like a predator. The nearest village was 12 miles through trackless jungle, but it was civilization, safety, people who might have answers about what her husband had really been doing. Maya stuffed supplies into her backpack, water, energy bars, the satellite phone that seemed increasingly useless with each failed attempt to get a signal. The laboratory called to her from below, promising more clues, more horrifying revelations, but those answers weren't worth her life. She was reaching for the door when something scratched at the roof above her head. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause, like Morse code tapped by massive claws. Maya tilted her head back, watching dust filter down from between the wooden planks. The scratching moved from the center of the roof toward the edge, directly above the door. Whatever was up there knew where she wanted to go. The scratching stopped. In the suffocating quiet that followed, Maya could hear her own ragged breathing and the frantic pulse of blood in her ears. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, clutching a kitchen knife in one trembling hand. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maya was beginning to think the creature had moved on when the door handle turned. She bit back a scream as metal clicked against metal. The door was locked. She'd checked it 3 times, but the handle continued to rotate with impossible slowness. Something outside was testing the mechanism, learning how it worked. The handle stopped moving. Silence stretched like a held breath. Then, with deliberate precision, something knocked 3 times. Maya's legs gave out. She slumped against the wall, knife clattering to the floor as the terrible truth crashed over her. Whatever David had created in that laboratory wasn't just hunting her, it was thinking. The metallic tang of blood filled Maya's mouth as she pressed herself against the laboratory wall, her heart hammering so violently she was certain whatever lurked outside could hear it. The scratching had stopped, replaced by something infinitely worse. Silence. She forced herself to breathe slowly, fighting the urge to call out David's name. Dead men didn't answer, and whatever had made those sounds wasn't human. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the sterile equipment that surrounded her like accusatory witnesses to her husband's secrets. Maya's eyes swept the laboratory again, taking in details she'd missed during her initial shock. Banks of computers lined one wall, their screens dark but power lights still blinking. Glass containers filled with murky liquid sat on reinforced shelves, and she could swear she saw something moving in the largest one, a pale, writhing mass that made her stomach clench. A manila folder lay open on the central workbench, and Maya crept toward it on trembling legs. David's handwriting covered the pages, the familiar loops and crosses of his penmanship now seeming foreign and threatening. She read the first entry, dated 3 years ago. Day 1. Initial samples collected from the northeastern quadrant. The indigenous warnings appear to be more than superstition. The organism displays unprecedented regenerative properties and seems to respond to external stimuli in ways that challenge conventional biology. Her hands shook as she turned the page. 3 years. David had been lying to her for 3 years. Day 15. First successful cultivation. The specimen has tripled in size and shows signs of intelligence. It appears to be learning, adapting to its environment faster than any known organism. Dr. Reeves thinks we're looking at something evolutionary. Dr. Reeves. Maya didn't recognize the name, but someone else had been involved in this madness, someone who might still be alive, still conducting these experiments. The lights flickered, and Maya's head snapped up. Through the laboratory's single window, she could see the jungle pressed against the glass like a living wall. Vines had grown across the surface since yesterday, she was certain of it. Thick, dark tendrils that pulsed with an almost rhythmic motion. A soft thud echoed from somewhere above her, then another. Footsteps on the hut's main floor. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Someone was in the hut. Her first instinct was relief. Another person. Someone who could help her understand what David had been doing. But the footsteps were wrong somehow. Too heavy and oddly spaced, as if the person walking was learning how to use their legs. She grabbed the folder and stuffed it into her jacket, then moved toward the ladder leading up to the hidden entrance. Each rung felt like it might give way beneath her weight, metal groaning softly in protest. Above her, the footsteps had stopped. Maya pressed her ear to the trapdoor. Silence. Then, a sound that made her blood freeze, a wet, sliding noise, like something large and boneless dragging itself across the wooden floor. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space. Maya fumbled for it, desperate to silence the device before whatever was upstairs heard it. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Don't come up. It's waiting for you." Maya stared at the message, her mind reeling. Someone was watching her, someone who knew she was down here. She typed back with shaking fingers, "Oh, who is this?" The response came immediately. "But Dr. Reeves, David's partner. I've been monitoring the lab remotely. The specimen escaped containment 2 days ago." The wet sliding sound above grew louder, moving in circles now, as if searching. Maya typed frantically, "What is it?" Something that should have been left alone. David wouldn't listen. "Check the emergency exit. East wall, behind the computer bank. I'm sending coordinates for a safe location." Maya looked toward the eastern wall and saw it, a barely visible seam in the concrete, hidden behind towers of humming processors. She moved as quietly as possible, but her foot caught a cable and sent a clipboard clattering to the floor. The sounds above stopped instantly. Maya held her breath for 10 agonizing seconds before a new sound made her knees weak, scratching, but not from outside this time. Something was scratching at the trapdoor directly above her head, and she could see wood shavings beginning to fall like snow. Her phone buzzed again. Move. Now. She ran toward the hidden exit, no longer caring about noise. Behind her, the scratching intensified, joined by a sound she would later struggle to describe, like whispers in a language that predated human speech. The emergency panel required a code, and Maya punched in David's birthday with desperate fingers. Nothing happened. Their anniversary, still nothing. The trapdoor splintered above her, and something pale and glistening began forcing its way through the opening. Maya tried one more combination, the date they'd first come to the jungle together, and the panel slid open with a pneumatic hiss. She dove through the opening just as something landed heavily on the laboratory floor behind her. The generator's hum had become Maya's lullaby over the past 3 sleepless nights, but now even that mechanical comfort was failing her. She jolted awake to complete silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. The darkness pressed against the windows like something alive, and she fumbled for the flashlight beside her makeshift bed on the laboratory floor. The beam cut through the black, revealing the familiar chaos of David's equipment. But something was different. The specimen jars that lined the shelves, she could swear there had been more of them yesterday. Now several sat empty, their contents vanished, leaving only residual stains on the glass like accusations. A sound outside made her freeze. Not the usual symphony of nocturnal insects and distant howler monkeys, but something methodical, rhythmic, like footsteps, but too heavy to be human. Maya crept to the window, keeping the flashlight beam low. The jungle beyond looked different in the artificial light, twisted, almost geometric in its wrongness. Vines hung in perfect spirals, and the leaves seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm. She blinked hard, wondering if exhaustion was finally claiming her sanity. Then she saw it. A shape moved between the trees, easily 8 feet tall, its limbs too long and joints bending in ways that defied anatomy. It moved with purpose, heading directly toward the hut. Maya stumbled backward, her elbow catching one of David's journals and sending it crashing to the floor. The movement outside stopped. In the terrible silence that followed, Maya held her breath until her lungs burned. Minutes crawled by before she heard the footsteps again, circling the building now, testing, probing. Whatever David had created or awakened, it was learning. She grabbed the journal from the floor, her hands shaking as she flipped through pages by flashlight. David's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, his scientific detachment crumbling into something approaching terror. Day 127. The symbiosis is accelerating. Subject exhibits rapid cellular regeneration, but the psychological integration remains unstable. It speaks now, but the voice carries harmonics that shouldn't be possible with human vocal cords. Day 130. Lost contact with the research station. Radio equipment functional, but no response from the outside. The jungle has changed. Growth patterns suggest external influence. Beginning to suspect the organism's reach extends far beyond the immediate test subject. Day 134. God forgive me. It's not just adapting to human biology, it's improving it. The strength, the enhanced senses, the way it moves through the canopy like gravity means nothing. But the eyes, there's still something human in the eyes, and that might be the most horrifying part. A crash from the main hut made Maya's blood freeze. Glass shattering, furniture overturning. It was inside. She killed the flashlight and pressed herself against the laboratory wall, feeling for David's emergency kit in the darkness. Her fingers found the flare gun he'd mentioned in his notes. Apparently, even brilliant scientists had moments of practical paranoia. The sounds from the main building grew closer. Deliberate destruction, as if something was searching through their belongings with the subtlety of a hurricane. Then, cutting through the chaos, came a voice. Maya. A name, spoken in David's voice but wrong somehow, layered with undertones that made her teeth ache. She bit down on her knuckle to keep from crying out. I know you're here, Maya. I can smell your fear. It's intoxicating. The voice was definitely David's, but it carried an alien cadence, as if something else was learning to use his vocal cords like an ill-fitting instrument. She remembered his final journal entry, the one that had made her skin crawl. And the organism doesn't just take over, it integrates. The host remains conscious throughout the process, aware but powerless to stop the changes. Footsteps approached the laboratory door, heavy, uneven, like someone learning to walk on legs that had been fundamentally altered. Maya raised the flare gun with trembling hands, knowing it would likely prove useless against whatever David had become. The door handle turned. In desperation, she fired the flare not at the approaching figure, but at the chemical storage cabinet David had warned her about in his notes. The magnesium burn ignited something that turned the laboratory into a miniature sun, and Maya threw herself through the rear window as the explosion shattered the night. She hit the jungle floor hard, her shoulder screaming in protest, but adrenaline drove her to her feet. Behind her, the laboratory burned like a beacon, and something in the flames was screaming, not in David's voice now, but in harmonics that seemed to come from every tree, every leaf, every shadow. The jungle itself was crying out in pain and rage. Maya ran blindly into the darkness, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. She had no destination except away, no plan except survival. But as she stumbled through the undergrowth, she began to understand the true scope of David's mistake. He hadn't just created a monster. He had infected paradise itself. The laboratory's fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Maya forced herself to examine each workstation methodically. Her hands trembled as she opened drawer after drawer, revealing syringes, vials of murky liquid, and notebooks filled with David's familiar handwriting. The clinical precision of it all made her stomach churn. This wasn't the gentle botanist she'd married, but someone else entirely. She picked up one of the leather-bound journals, its pages yellowed and warped from humidity. David's notes began normally enough, documenting various plant species and their properties. But as she flipped deeper into the journal, the entries became increasingly erratic, filled with sketches of cellular structures and chemical formulas she couldn't understand. Day 847. She read aloud, her voice echoing in the sterile space. The symbiotic relationship is stronger than anticipated. The host organisms show remarkable adaptation, but the aggression levels are concerning. Must find a way to control the territorial responses. Host organisms. Maya's blood ran cold. She flipped to the next page where David had sketched what looked like root systems, but the drawings were wrong somehow, too geometric, too purposeful. At the bottom of the page, he'd written in red ink, "They're learning." A sound from above made her freeze. It was soft at first, like rain on the roof, but then it intensified into a rhythmic tapping. Not rain, something moving across the ceiling, something large. Maya grabbed the journal and backed toward the laboratory's exit, but the tapping followed her movement. Whatever was up there could track her position. Her heart hammered as she remembered David's words about territorial responses. Had his experiments created something that now considered this place, and her, a threat? She reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The trapdoor was still open, pale moonlight filtering down through the gap. The tapping had stopped, but somehow that was worse than the noise. She strained her ears, hearing only the jungle's usual symphony of insects and night birds. Taking a deep breath, Maya climbed the stairs slowly, clutching the journal to her chest. Each step creaked, despite her efforts to stay quiet. When she reached the top, she peered cautiously through the opening. The hut appeared empty, but something was different. The air smelled wrong, sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit mixed with something medicinal. And there, on the wooden floor near the window, were marks she hadn't noticed before. Deep scratches in the wood, too wide to be from any animal she knew. She hauled herself up through the trapdoor and immediately noticed that the front door stood open. She was certain she'd closed it. Beyond the threshold, the jungle pressed in like a living wall, and she could swear she saw movement in the undergrowth, not the random sway of vegetation, but purposeful, coordinated motion. Maya slammed the door shut and threw the bolt, then dragged a chair in front of it for good measure. Her hands shook as she opened the journal again, searching for answers. She found them 3 pages later in an entry that made her knees weak. The neural network extends much further than initially calculated. What I thought were separate organisms are actually nodes in a larger system. The jungle isn't just their habitat, it's become their nervous system. They can communicate across vast distances, coordinate responses, even problem-solve collectively. I may have created something beyond my ability to control. The scratching started again, this time on the walls. It came from multiple directions simultaneously. North, south, east, whatever was out there, it wasn't alone, and it was surrounding the hut. Maya's phone had no signal, of course. The nearest town was a 2-day hike through dense jungle, and she was beginning to understand that the vegetation itself might be working against her. David's final entries painted a picture of an ecosystem corrupted, turned into something that thought and planned and remembered threats. She found a pencil and began writing in the margin of David's journal, documenting her own experience. If something happened to her, maybe someone would eventually find the truth. Day 1, Maya Chen, David's widow. The experiments are still active. The subjects show coordinated behavior and apparent intelligence. I think they know I'm here. A new sound reached her ears, a low humming that seemed to come from the jungle itself. It wasn't quite mechanical, wasn't quite organic, but something in between. The sound grew louder, and the scratching on the walls intensified. Through the window, she could see the trees moving in a pattern that defied the gentle night breeze. Branches bent inward, pointing toward the hut like accusing fingers. Vines slithered across the ground with snake-like purpose, and in the darkness between the trees, she caught glimpses of something that might once have been normal jungle flora, but now pulsed with an eerie bioluminescence. David's final journal entry was a single line: "They remember everything, and they hold grudges." The humming grew louder, and Maya realized with growing horror that it sounded almost like singing, a chorus of voices that had never been meant for music. The darkness pressed against Maya like a living thing as she crouched behind the overturned lab table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sounds outside had stopped. No more rustling, no more of that wet, sliding noise that made her skin crawl. but the silence felt worse somehow, pregnant with menace. She clutched David's journal to her chest, its leather binding slick with her sweat. The pages she'd read replayed in her mind like a fever dream: Project Symbiosis, neural integration with plant consciousness, the natives' warnings about awakening something that had slept in the deep jungle for millennia. A soft scratching came from the laboratory's ceiling. Maya's eyes darted upward, following the sound as it moved from corner to corner with deliberate precision. Something was testing the roof's weak points. She had to get out. The emergency exit David had mentioned in his notes, where was it? Maya forced herself to think past the terror clouding her judgment. He'd written about a backup route, a tunnel that led to the old mining shaft half a mile north. The scratching stopped. In the sudden quiet, Maya heard her own ragged breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the lab's depths. Then came a new sound that froze her blood, a voice, muffled and distorted, calling her name. Maya, Maya, where are you? It sounded like David. Her rational mind screamed that it was impossible, that David was dead, that this was some trick of whatever lurked in the jungle outside. But her heart betrayed her, responding to the familiar cadence of his voice with a desperate hope. I know you're in there, love. I've been waiting for you to come home. The voice was closer now, just outside the main entrance. Maya bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, using the pain to anchor herself to reality. David was gone. She'd held his ashes, scattered them herself. Whatever was speaking with his voice was not her husband. She forced herself to move, creeping deeper into the laboratory. Emergency exit, she reminded herself. Find the emergency exit. The lab stretched back further than she'd realized, a maze of workbenches and strange equipment that cast weird shadows in the dim light filtering through the small windows. Here, the jungle's influence was more obvious. Thick vines had pushed through cracks in the walls, and the air hung heavy with the scent of decomposing vegetation. Maya, please. I need to show you something wonderful. The voice had moved. It was circling the building now, probing. Maya pressed herself against a cabinet filled with specimen jars, trying to steady her breathing. In the greenish light, she could see the contents of the jars more clearly, plant samples that seemed to pulse with their own bioluminescence, root systems that appeared to writhe even in their preservative solution. A new horror crept up her spine. What if the voice wasn't coming from outside at all? What if it was being projected directly into her mind, the way David had described in his notes about neural integration with the jungle's consciousness? She shook her head violently, trying to dispel the thought. Focus, find the exit. At the laboratory's far end, she spotted what she was looking for, a heavy wooden door partially concealed behind a curtain of hanging vines. The growth looked deliberate, as if the jungle was trying to hide the exit from prying eyes, or perhaps trying to seal it shut. Maya pushed through the vegetation, her skin prickling where the leaves brushed against her. Some of the plants felt unnaturally warm, almost feverish to the touch. She grasped the door handle and pulled. Nothing. The door was either locked or blocked from the other side. There you are. Maya spun around, her heart stopping. The voice was inside the lab now, coming from somewhere in the shadows between the workbenches, but she could see no one, nothing but the familiar chaos of David's research station. You've been reading my journal, the voice continued, and now she could hear something wrong with it, a slight echo, a harmonic quality that no human throat could produce. Good. Then you understand what we've accomplished here. David's dead, Maya whispered, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Whatever you are, you're not him. Laughter drifted through the lab, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Death is such a limited concept, don't you think? Your husband discovered that consciousness is far more transferable than anyone imagined. Maya renewed her efforts with the door, throwing her full weight against it. The wood groaned but held firm. Behind her, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, but with an odd shuffle that suggested the walker wasn't entirely comfortable with bipedal movement. He volunteered, you know, the voice said, closer now. In the end, when he realized what we could become together, he welcomed the integration. He wanted you to join us too. We've been preparing a place for you. The door suddenly gave way, and Maya tumbled forward into a narrow earthen tunnel that sloped downward into absolute darkness. The screaming started at dawn. Maya jolted awake on the laboratory floor, her makeshift bed of lab coats providing little comfort against the concrete. The sound pierced through the jungle like a siren, high-pitched, agonized, and undeniably human. But as she pressed her ear to the reinforced door, she realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below. Her blood turned to ice as she remembered David's journal entry about the lower levels. She'd assumed it was metaphorical, but now, scanning the laboratory with fresh eyes, she noticed what she'd missed before. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a bank of servers, was a heavy metal hatch set into the floor. The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving only the hum of machinery and her own ragged breathing. Maya approached the hatch with trembling hands. The wheel lock was marked with biohazard symbols and warnings in multiple languages, but it was David's handwritten note taped beside it that made her stomach lurch. Emergency containment protocols. Maya's eyes only. Her name. He'd written her name. The wheel turned easier than expected, as if it had been used recently. The hatch opened to reveal a narrow ladder descending into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on automatically, illuminating a corridor that stretched beyond her vision. She grabbed a flashlight and David's pistol. She'd found it in his desk drawer, still loaded, and began her descent. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something organic and wrong. The corridor branched in multiple directions, but only one path showed recent foot traffic. Maya followed the disturbed dust, her flashlight beam dancing across walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits. More of David's notes were posted at regular intervals, documenting what he called behavioral modifications and neural pathway restructuring. She was reading his theory about consciousness transfer between host organisms when she heard it, a soft whimpering from somewhere ahead, not the tortured screaming from before, but something worse, something broken. The corridor opened into a larger chamber filled with observation cells. Each one was fronted with reinforced glass, and most were empty. But in the cell at the far end, something moved in the shadows. Maya's flashlight beam found it, and she immediately wished it hadn't. The thing in the cell had once been human. She could see that much from its general shape, the remnants of clothing hanging from its frame. But the skin had taken on a mottled, bark-like texture, and where its eyes should have been, clusters of small flowers bloomed. Vine-like appendages emerged from its mouth and nose, writhing slowly in the artificial light. On the observation clipboard hanging beside the cell, David's handwriting was shakier than usual. Subject 7, Day 23 post-exposure. Consciousness appears intact but unable to communicate, shows distress when separated from plant matter. Recommend immediate termination, but Maya must see this first. Maya's legs gave out. She slumped against the corridor wall, the full horror of David's work crashing over her. This wasn't just about illegal experiments. He'd been turning people into something else entirely. Her husband, the man who'd brought her flowers every Friday, who'd held her during thunderstorms, who'd kissed her forehead every morning before leaving for work, had been creating monsters. The creature in the cell turned toward her flashlight beam. When it opened what remained of its mouth, a sound emerged that was almost recognizable as speech, almost human. Ma, ya. She scrambled backward, her flashlight falling and casting wild shadows across the walls. The thing knew her name. How could it know her name? Other cells began to show movement. Shapes that had been still moments before started pressing against their glass prisons. More voices joined the first, a chorus of broken syllables that might have been her name, might have been pleas for help, might have been warnings. Maya ran. She sprinted down the corridor, taking turns at random, desperate to escape the sounds behind her. Emergency lights strobed overhead as her footsteps triggered motion sensors. The facility was larger than she'd imagined, with sections devoted to equipment she didn't recognize and storage rooms filled with specimens floating in chemical baths. In what appeared to be David's primary workspace, she found his video logs, dozens of recordings, dating back 3 years. She grabbed the most recent disc and several others, stuffing them into a jacket. Whatever David had discovered, whatever he'd been doing, the evidence had to survive even if she didn't. The jungle above had seemed dangerous, but this underground nightmare was worse. At least the predators outside followed natural laws. Down here, David had broken the fundamental rules that separated plant from animal, human from monster, life from something far more terrible. As Maya found the ladder back to the main laboratory, she could still hear them calling her name in their broken voices. Subject 7 and all the others, trapped between human consciousness and vegetative existence, aware enough to suffer but too changed to die. Her husband hadn't just disturbed something in the jungle. He'd brought it home. The screaming started again at dawn, but this time it came from inside the laboratory. Maya bolted upright from where she'd been dozing against the supply closet door, her makeshift barricade of equipment still holding firm. The sound echoed through the concrete walls, not quite human, but close enough to make her skin crawl. She pressed her ear to the metal door, listening to the chaos beyond. Something was moving in there, something big. The journal entries she'd read through the night painted a horrifying picture. David hadn't been studying the jungle's ecosystem, he'd been trying to weaponize it, the samples, the growth accelerants, the neural stimulation experiments. He'd found something in the deepest part of the rainforest, something that predated human civilization, and he'd tried to control it. Now it was loose. Maya checked her phone again, still no signal, and the battery was down to 12%. The satellite phone from David's desk sat useless beside her, its screen cracked from when she'd knocked it off the table during her frantic escape into the closet. Her hands shook as she rifled through the supply boxes around her, looking for anything that might serve as a weapon. Medical supplies, chemical samples. Nothing useful against whatever was systematically destroying the lab outside. The screaming stopped. In the sudden silence, Maya could hear her own ragged breathing and the steady drip of something liquid hitting the floor. She didn't want to think about what that liquid might be. The ventilation system hummed overhead, circulating air that now carried an acrid, organic smell, like rotting vegetation mixed with industrial chemicals. A soft scratching sound came from directly above her head. Maya looked up at the ceiling tiles, watching in horror as a dark stain began to spread across the white panels. The scratching grew more insistent, accompanied by what sounded like whispered voices speaking in a language she'd never heard. The stain widened, and she could see the tiles beginning to sag under some unseen weight. She had to get out of here. Moving as quietly as possible, Maya began dismantling her barricade. Each piece of equipment felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands, but she managed to create a small opening near the door handle. Through the gap, she could see into the laboratory's main chamber. The destruction was complete. Every computer monitor lay shattered on the floor, their screens reflecting the emergency lighting in jagged fragments. The specimen containers had been torn open, their contents, whatever they had been, now scattered across the walls in abstract patterns that hurt to look at directly. Deep gouges scarred the concrete walls, as if something with massive claws had tried to dig its way through solid rock. But the lab appeared empty. Maya eased the door open another inch, straining to see the exit. The main door to the laboratory hung off its hinges, twisted metal curled back like the petals of some mechanical flower. Beyond it lay the tunnel that led back to David's hut. If she could make it that far, she might be able to reach the radio equipment David kept hidden in the bedroom. The ceiling tile above her head gave way with a wet thump, and something dropped into the supply closet behind her. Maya didn't look back. She shoved through the door opening, cutting her shoulder on a piece of broken equipment, and ran for the laboratory exit. Her bare feet slipped on the debris-covered floor, but she managed to stay upright, driven by the sound of movement in the closet behind her. The tunnel stretched ahead of her like a throat, the emergency lighting casting shifting shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Maya's lungs burned as she ran, her nightgown catching on the rocky protrusions. Behind her, she could hear pursuit, not footsteps exactly, but a rhythmic scraping sound, like something being dragged across stone. The tunnel seemed longer than she remembered, stretching endlessly upward toward the hut. Her legs felt like water, threatening to give out with each step. The scraping sound grew closer, accompanied by that same whispered language she'd heard in the closet. The words seemed to burrow into her mind, carrying meanings she didn't want to understand. Maya burst through the hidden entrance into David's bedroom, her momentum carrying her halfway across the room before she could stop. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making her realize how long she'd been trapped underground. The normal sounds of the jungle, bird calls, insect buzz, wind through leaves, seemed impossibly peaceful after the horrors below. She slammed the hidden panel shut and dragged David's dresser across it, knowing it wouldn't hold for long. The radio equipment sat on the far side of the room, its red power light beckoning like salvation. If she could reach it, if she could get through to someone, anyone. The whispered voices were getting louder, and the panel behind the dresser was beginning to bulge outward. Maya dove for the radio just as the hidden door exploded open, sending splinters of wood across the room like shrapnel. The jungle floor seemed to pulse beneath Maya's feet as she crept through the underbrush, following the narrow animal trail that Carlos had shown her on his hand-drawn map. Every shadow held potential threat, every rustling leaf a warning. The canopy above blocked most of the afternoon sun, leaving her in a perpetual twilight that made her skin crawl. She'd been walking for 2 hours since leaving the village, and the weight of the machete at her side provided little comfort. Carlos had insisted she take it, along with a canvas bag filled with supplies and something he called protection, a collection of herbs and carved stones that she didn't entirely believe in, but wasn't foolish enough to refuse. The old man's words echoed in her mind, and the corruption spreads outward from the source. You must find where your husband first disturbed the earth. According to Carlos, there was another site deeper in the jungle, a place where Marcus had conducted his earliest experiments before moving his operation closer to the hut. If she could find it, she might understand what had started this nightmare, and more importantly, how to stop it. The trail wound deeper into territory she'd never explored, past massive cecropia trees draped in strangling vines. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, carrying scents that reminded her uncomfortably of the laboratory. Sweet decay mixed with something chemical and wrong. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, and Maya froze. She'd been hearing sounds of pursuit for the last 30 minutes, never close enough to see clearly, but persistent enough to keep her nerves on edge. When she turned to look, she caught glimpses of movement that seemed too coordinated to be random animals. She pressed forward, knowing that stopping would only make her more vulnerable. The trail began to descend into a natural depression, where the jungle grew even denser. Massive buttress roots created cathedral-like spaces between the trees, and the ground squelched wetly beneath her boots. That's when she smelled it, the unmistakable stench of Marcus's experiments, but magnified tenfold. Her stomach lurched as she pushed through a curtain of hanging vines and found herself in a circular clearing. The sight that greeted her defied immediate comprehension. The clearing looked like a wound in the earth itself. Trees grew in impossible spirals, their trunks twisted into DNA-like helixes. Flowers bloomed in colors that hurt to look at directly, electric blues and violent purples that seemed to shift and writhe. The grass beneath her feet felt spongy, almost flesh-like, and when she looked closer she could see it pulsing with a faint rhythm. In the center of this aberrant garden stood the ruins of Marcus's original laboratory. Unlike the hidden room beneath the hut, this structure made no attempt at concealment. Metal tables corroded by years of exposure supported equipment she couldn't identify. Glass containers lay shattered among the vegetation, their contents long since absorbed into the soil. Maya approached cautiously, her skin crawling as she noticed how the mutated plants seemed to track her movement. A vine that resembled a giant nerve ending twitched as she passed, and somewhere in the canopy above, something that might once have been a bird let out a sound like electronic feedback. She found Marcus's field notebook wedged beneath an overturned centrifuge, its pages swollen with moisture but still partially readable. His handwriting, familiar after 20 years of marriage, documented a progression of experiments that made her blood run cold. Successfully isolated the regenerative compound from specimens. Initial tests on plant matter show remarkable results. Day 45. Cellular restructuring exceeding all expectations. The compound doesn't just heal, it improves. Evolution in real time. Day 67. First signs of environmental contamination. The jungle is adapting to the presence of the compound. Must relocate primary operations. Day 78. The changes are accelerating. Something in the soil is amplifying the effects. I fear I've awakened something that was meant to stay dormant. The final entry was barely legible, written in what looked like haste. Day 82. They're coming. The things we've created, moving the research to Site B. If something happens to me, Maya must never come here. The jungle remembers everything. A low, growling sound from the edge of the clearing made Maya's head snap up. Her blood turned to ice as she saw them. Creatures that might once have been jaguars, but were now something far worse. Their spotted coats had been replaced by skin that seemed to shift between plant and animal tissue. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along their flanks, and their eyes glowed with an intelligence that was distinctly unnatural. There were 3 of them, positioned at different points around the clearing's perimeter. They moved with predatory patience, cutting off her escape routes one by one. Maya clutched the machete with sweating palms, knowing it would be useless against creatures that had been fundamentally altered by Marcus's work. The mutated plants around her seemed to sense the impending violence, their movements becoming more agitated. As the lead creature tensed its muscles to spring, Maya made a desperate decision. She pulled one of Carlos's herb bundles from her bag and crushed it in her palm, hoping the old man's faith in traditional protection wasn't misplaced. The reaction was immediate and startling. The creatures recoiled as if struck, their bioluminescent patterns flickering erratically. But Maya could see it was only a temporary reprieve. The screaming started at dawn. Maya bolted upright in the makeshift shelter she'd constructed against a massive cecropia tree, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound wasn't human, couldn't be human, yet it carried an agonized intelligence that made her skin crawl. Through the canopy above, the first pale fingers of sunlight filtered down like accusatory spotlights, illuminating the devastation around her. The jungle was dying. Where yesterday there had been vibrant green undergrowth, now brown and withered vines hung like funeral shrouds. The air itself felt wrong, thick with a metallic taste that coated her tongue and made breathing feel like drowning. Maya pressed her back against the tree trunk, watching in horror as a brilliant morpho butterfly landed on a nearby leaf, its iridescent wings flickering once before it simply stopped. The insect crumpled and fell, joining the growing carpet of corpses at the forest floor. She fumbled for the radio Chen had given her, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the frequency. Static crackled, then his voice emerged, distant and broken. "Maya? Maya, are you there?" "I'm here," she whispered, afraid to speak louder in case something heard her. "Chen, something's happening. The jungle is—" "No," his voice cut through her words. "We're seeing it too. The decay is spreading outward from your husband's lab in a perfect circle. Whatever he was working with, it's not just affecting individual organisms anymore. It's breaking down the entire ecosystem." Maya closed her eyes, remembering David's journal entries about accelerated evolution and environmental adaptation protocols. She'd thought she understood the scope of his experiments, but this was beyond anything she'd imagined. How fast is it spreading? Roughly a mile every 8 hours. At this rate, it'll reach the nearest village by tomorrow night. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Hundreds of people, children, all of them facing the same agonizing transformation she'd witnessed in the howler monkeys, their bodies betraying them as David's creation rewrote the fundamental rules of biology. "There has to be a way to stop it," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt the weight of their futility. "We're working on it. The research team thinks if we can find David's original samples, the source organism, we might be able to synthesize some kind of neutralizing agent. But Maya," Chen's voice grew heavy with reluctance, "you're the only one close enough to the lab site to retrieve them, and time is running out." Maya stared at the dying jungle around her, watching as another tree began to show the telltale signs of infection. Leaves curling inward, bark darkening to an unnatural black. Going back to David's laboratory meant facing whatever had emerged from his experiments, the thing that had been hunting her through the jungle for 2 days. But staying here meant watching the world rot around her, knowing she could have acted. "Tell me what to look for," she said quietly. Chen's relief was audible even through the static. David's notes mentioned specimen containers labeled Genesis series. They should be in a refrigeration unit, probably marked with biohazard symbols. The samples will look like, well, we're not entirely sure. Some kind of microscopic organism possibly suspended in a nutrient solution. Maya shouldered her pack and began moving through the deteriorating jungle, following the path of destruction back toward its source. Each step felt like descending deeper into hell. The screaming had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow worse. Even the insects had fallen quiet, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. As she walked, she noticed something else, tracks in the soft earth, running parallel to her own path. They weren't quite human, the toes too long and the gait too wide, but they showed an unmistakable intelligence in how they avoided the worst of the infected areas. Whatever was following her had learned to navigate David's poison jungle, adapting to its toxicity with frightening efficiency. The laboratory complex materialized through the dying foliage like a concrete tumor. Maya crouched behind a fallen log, studying the building that had once been her husband's greatest secret. The steel walls were streaked with the same dark infection that plagued the jungle, and several windows had been shattered from the inside, their jagged edges glinting in the filtered sunlight. She keyed the radio one more time. "I can see the lab. There's damage, but the main structure looks intact." "Be careful, Maya. Our satellite readings are showing massive electromagnetic disturbances in that area. Whatever's in there with David's experiments, it's not following normal biological patterns anymore." Maya switched off the radio and checked the pistol Chen's team had dropped for her. 6 bullets remained, a pathetically small defense against something that had already proven immune to conventional weapons. But as she watched another section of jungle wither and die, she realized that fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. The dying world around her demanded action, and she was the only one left to provide it. The morning light filtered through the canopy in fractured beams as Maya pressed deeper into the jungle, following the coordinates she'd found in David's encrypted files. Her backpack held everything she could salvage from the laboratory before the fire consumed it entirely: samples, notes, and most importantly, the GPS device that would lead her to what David had called the source. The jungle seemed different now, more aware. Vines shifted without wind, and the very air hummed with an energy that made her skin crawl. She'd been walking for 3 hours when she first heard it, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Maya checked the GPS. 2 kilometers to go. The sound grew stronger with each step, like a massive heartbeat buried deep underground. Ancient trees towered around her, their trunks scarred with strange markings that looked almost like writing. She stopped to examine one, running her fingers over the deep grooves. They were too precise to be natural, too purposeful. Someone, or something, had carved these symbols long ago. Her satellite phone buzzed. Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the static. "Maya, where are you? The authorities found the remains of your hut. They're treating it as a potential bioterror incident." "I'm following David's trail," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "He found something out here, something that's been here for a very long time. You need to get out of there. The samples you sent, they're unlike anything we've ever seen. The cellular structure is completely alien. It's as if they're not bound by the same biological laws that govern everything else on Earth. Maya's blood ran cold. What are you saying? I'm saying your husband may have discovered something that predates human civilization. And if the jungle is responding to your presence the way you described, then you've awakened something that was meant to stay buried. The line went dead. Maya stared at the phone, her hands trembling. The pulsing sound grew louder, almost deafening now. She forced herself to continue walking, driven by a desperate need to understand what David had been hiding from her all these years. The jungle began to change around her. The plants grew larger, more vibrant, their colors shifting in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Flowers bloomed and withered in seconds, their petals falling like snow. The very air shimmered with an otherworldly energy, and then she saw it. In the center of a vast clearing stood a structure that defied explanation. It wasn't quite a building, wasn't quite a natural formation. Organic curves blended seamlessly with geometric patterns, as if architecture and biology had merged into something entirely new. The surface pulsed with bioluminescent veins that matched the rhythm of the sound she'd been hearing. Maya approached slowly, her heart hammering. This was what David had found. This was his secret. Structure's surface rippled at her touch, warm and strangely yielding. As her palm made contact, images flooded her mind, visions of David standing in this same spot, his face filled with wonder and terror. She saw him taking samples, setting up monitoring equipment, documenting everything with the methodical precision she remembered from their early days together. She also saw something else. In the later visions, David looked haggard, desperate. He was arguing with someone, shadowy figures in expensive suits who spoke of military applications and profit margins. They wanted to weaponize whatever he'd discovered here. That's when she understood. David hadn't been conducting illegal experiments. He'd been trying to protect this place. The visions shifted, showing her something that made her stumble backward in horror. The structure wasn't just ancient, it was alive. And it was dying. David's samples, his research, everything he'd done was an attempt to understand why this incredible organism was slowly succumbing to some unknown disease. But his corporate sponsors had different plans. They wanted to extract its essence, to synthesize it for their own purposes. They didn't care that removing it would kill not just the organism, but potentially the entire ecosystem that had evolved around it. Maya pulled her hand away, gasping. The jungle's hostility suddenly made sense. It wasn't hunting her out of malice. It was trying to protect itself. David's death, the lab hidden beneath their home, his secretive behavior in those final months, it all clicked into place. Her husband had been murdered for refusing to betray this place. A sound behind her made Maya spin around. Men in military fatigues were emerging from the jungle, weapons raised. Their leader, a cold-eyed man with colonel's insignia, smiled grimly. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you've led us quite a chase." Maya backed toward the structure. "You killed him. You killed David because he wouldn't let you destroy this." "Your husband was an idealistic fool," the colonel replied, "but his research will still serve its purpose. As will you." The structure behind her began to pulse faster, its bioluminescent veins flaring brighter. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. Maya pressed both hands against the warm surface and whispered, "I'm sorry, David. I understand now." The organism responded with a surge of energy that lit up the clearing like day. The compass needle spun wildly in Maya's palm, a frantic dance that made no sense. North should be north, unchanging and reliable, but here in this corrupted pocket of jungle, even the laws of physics seemed negotiable. The metallic taste in her mouth had grown stronger since she'd destroyed the laboratory, coating her tongue with the flavor of old pennies and regret. Behind her, the sound of pursuit had changed. No longer the chaotic crash of displaced wildlife, it had become something more deliberate, a rhythmic rustle that suggested coordination, intelligence. Whatever David had awakened was learning, adapting, organizing itself into something far more dangerous than a mindless force of nature. Maya forced herself to keep moving, though every step felt like walking through quicksand. The vegetation around her had taken on an oily sheen, leaves glistening with a substance that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. When she'd tried to touch one of the affected plants earlier, her fingers had come away numb, the sensation not returning for nearly an hour. The path, if it could still be called that, twisted through increasingly alien landscape. Trees grew in impossible spirals, their bark split open to reveal pulsing interior chambers that reminded her uncomfortably of internal organs. Flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, their petals seeming to shift and writhe when observed peripherally. The very air shimmered with an iridescence that made depth perception unreliable. David's journal, clutched against her chest, felt heavier with each passing moment. Not physically, that would have been easier to understand. Instead, it carried the weight of 20 years of lies, of a marriage built on foundations that were crumbling beneath the weight of terrible truth. Every page she'd managed to read had revealed another layer of deception, another betrayal of everything she'd thought she knew about the man she'd loved. The expedition notes were the worst. Reading David's clinical observations about the indigenous people who'd first warned him away from this place, she'd discovered a callousness that made her stomach turn. He'd dismissed their concerns as primitive superstition, even as he carefully documented the physical changes that proximity to his discovery caused. Hair loss, skin lesions, neurological deterioration. He'd recorded it all with scientific detachment while continuing his work. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, too loud and too close. Maya glanced back and immediately wished she hadn't. The jungle that had closed in behind her path bore no resemblance to anything that should exist on Earth. The canopy writhed like a living thing, and between the twisted trunks, shapes moved with predatory purpose. Some were recognizable, the distorted forms of animals that had once been normal, but others defied categorization entirely. She turned back to the path and nearly collided with a spider web that spanned the entire width between two trees. The web itself was unremarkable, but the spider perched at its center was the size of a dinner plate, its carapace gleaming with the same oily iridescence that affected everything else in this pocket of hell. Worse, it had too many eyes. Arranged in a pattern that suggested bilateral symmetry had become a suggestion rather than a rule. The spider's multiple gazes fixed on her, and Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Intelligence looked back at her, alien and hungry and far too knowing. It began to move across its web with deliberate slowness, each step seeming to test her resolve. Maya backed away, fighting the urge to run. Sudden movement might trigger an attack, and she had no illusions about her ability to outrun something that could navigate the altered jungle with native ease. Instead, she reached slowly into her pack and withdrew the emergency flare she'd been saving. The spider paused, head tilting in a disturbingly human gesture of curiosity. The flare ignited with a brilliant red hiss, and the effect was immediate. The spider recoiled, its web beginning to smoke and curl, but more importantly, the oily sheen on the surrounding vegetation seemed to retreat from the light, pulling back like a living thing seeking shadow. Maya didn't hesitate. She ducked under the dissolving web and pushed forward, holding the flare high. The path ahead became more defined as the flare's light pushed back the wrongness that had been encroaching from all sides. She could see what looked like normal jungle in the distance, actual green instead of the sickly phosphorescence that had dominated the landscape around David's laboratory. Hope sparked in her chest, fragile but real. But the flare wouldn't last forever, and the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. Whatever controlled this place had noticed her escape attempt and was mobilizing to stop her. She could hear the rustle of movement converging on her position, a sound like a dozen different predators moving in coordinated formation. Maya broke into a run, racing against time and the dying light of her salvation, while behind her the jungle marshaled its forces for one final attempt to claim her. The helicopter's rotors sliced through the humid air as Maya pressed herself against the cabin wall, watching the jungle canopy rush past below. Dr. Chen sat across from her, his weathered face grim as he studied the tablet displaying satellite imagery of the area around David's laboratory. "The growth pattern is accelerating," he said, pointing to patches of unnaturally vibrant green that seemed to pulse even in the static images. "Whatever your husband unleashed, it's spreading faster than we anticipated." Maya's stomach churned. Through the headset, she could hear the pilot's tense radio chatter with the military base. They were flying into what had been classified as a quarantine zone just hours after she'd escaped. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was voluntarily returning to the nightmare she'd barely survived. "There," she said, spotting the familiar clearing. But something was wrong. The laboratory building, which had been partially collapsed when she fled, now appeared to be completely consumed by a writhing mass of vegetation. Thick, rope-like vines covered every surface, and strange bioluminescent flowers pulsed with an eerie blue-green light, even in the afternoon sun. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. "I can't land there. The LZ is completely overgrown, and those plants... they're moving." Chen leaned forward, studying the scene below. "Circle the perimeter. We need to find another approach." As the helicopter banked, Maya caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. Bodies, or what had once been bodies. They were partially embedded in the thick root systems that now covered the forest floor, their forms twisted and contorted. Some still wore the remnants of military fatigues. "The advance team," Chen said quietly, following her gaze. "We lost contact with them 18 hours ago." Maya forced herself to look away from the grotesque scene. "How many people have died because of what David did?" "Too many. And there'll be more if we don't stop this." The helicopter continued its sweep, and Maya spotted a rocky outcropping about half a mile from the laboratory. It was the highest point in the area, relatively clear of the aggressive vegetation. "There," she said, pointing. "We can land there and approach on foot." Chen nodded to the pilot, who began his descent. As they touched down, Maya could feel the weight of her decision. She'd sworn she would never return to this place, yet here she was, carrying the journal that might hold the key to stopping the horror David had unleashed. They disembarked quickly, the pilot keeping the rotors spinning. "I'll maintain radio contact," he called over the noise. "You have 2 hours before I have to return to base for fuel. 2 hours to potentially save countless lives." Maya shouldered her pack, which contained the antidote samples she'd managed to synthesize from David's notes during the flight. Chen carried more sophisticated equipment: scanners, sample containers, and a device he called a biological neutralizer that Maya hoped would prove more effective than it sounded. The descent toward the laboratory was treacherous. The normal jungle sounds were absent, replaced by an unsettling rustle that seemed to follow their movement. The vegetation grew more aggressive as they approached the epicenter. Vines reached toward them with deliberate intent, and Maya found herself constantly batting away tendrils that seemed to test their defenses. "The neural network is more advanced than we thought," Chen observed, using a machete to clear a path through a wall of thorny branches that had sprouted across what used to be a game trail. "It's learning, adapting to our presence." Maya checked her watch. They'd been walking for 40 minutes and were still 200 yards from the laboratory. At this rate, they'd never make it in time. Worse, she could see that the bioluminescent flowers were growing brighter as darkness approached, and she remembered all too well what happened in this jungle after sunset. "We need to move faster," she said, pulling out one of the antidote vials. David's notes mentioned that the organism responds to certain chemical signatures. This might give us safe passage. She poured the clear liquid onto the ground in front of them. The effect was immediate and startling. The aggressive vegetation recoiled, creating a narrow corridor through the dense growth. But Maya could see that the effect was temporary. Behind them, the plants were already beginning to encroach again. "It's working," Chen said, excitement creeping into his voice. "But we'll need to use it sparingly." "How much do you have?" Maya counted the remaining vials. 3 more. We'll have to make them count." They pressed forward through the temporary sanctuary the antidote had created. The laboratory building loomed ahead. now completely transformed into something that looked more biological than architectural. The walls pulsed with a rhythmic motion that resembled breathing, and the bioluminescent flowers had grown so dense that the structure glowed like a beacon in the gathering dusk. As they approached what had once been the main entrance, Maya realized that getting inside wouldn't be their biggest challenge. The real question was whether they'd live long enough to find what they came for. The creature's shriek pierced the night as Maya's machete found its mark, black ichor spraying across the laboratory walls. But instead of falling, the thing seemed to absorb the blade, its flesh rippling and reforming around the metal. Maya yanked desperately, but the weapon was trapped, fused into the writhing mass of what had once been her husband. "David," she whispered, backing away as more tendrils erupted from his torso. "I know you're still in there somewhere." The David thing tilted its head with an almost human gesture of curiosity. For a moment, its features stabilized, revealing glimpses of the man she'd married 20 years ago. His eyes, though filmed with that terrible luminescence, held a flicker of recognition. "Maya." The voice was David's, but layered with harmonics that made her teeth ache. "You shouldn't have come here. I tried to warn you through the recordings." She pressed herself against the laboratory wall, feeling the rough stone against her back. Around them, the jungle pressed closer, vines snaking through broken windows, as if drawn by the conversation. The transformation wasn't just affecting David, it was spreading outward, claiming everything. "The fungus," she said, forcing her voice steady. "You found it in the deeper caves, didn't you? That's what started all this." David's form rippled, struggling between human and something else entirely. "Not found, awakened. It's been sleeping here for millennia, waiting. The indigenous people knew, their warnings, their taboos. I thought I was smarter than their superstitions." A memory surfaced, David's excited phone calls in those final months, his talk of breakthrough discoveries, of changing everything they knew about biology. She'd been proud of his passion, never suspecting the horror it would unleash. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been like this?" "Time doesn't work the same way anymore." His face flickered, aging and regressing in rapid cycles. "The fungus doesn't just consume, it connects. I can feel every plant, every insect for miles. The jungle is my nervous system now." The vines at the windows pulsed in rhythm with his words, and Maya understood with growing horror that he was the jungle now. The attacks, the way the forest seemed to anticipate her movements, it had all been David, trapped in this nightmare form, unable to control what he'd become. "There has to be a way to reverse it," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how naive they sounded. David's laugh was like wind through dead leaves. "I thought so too. Months of experiments, trying to find an antidote. But the fungus isn't just parasitic, it's symbiotic. Remove it and everything dies. The forest, the ecosystem, me. It's all one organism now." Maya's hand found the emergency flare in her pocket, one of 3 she'd salvaged from the plane crash. The phosphorus would burn hot enough to sterilize the immediate area, but looking at the extent of the infestation, she realized how futile such measures would be. The contamination had spread far beyond this single laboratory. "The planes," she said suddenly. "The crashes weren't accidents. You've been bringing them down to prevent the infection from spreading." His nod was almost apologetic. "The fungus wants to expand, to reach new territories. Every few months, someone flies too close, gets curious about the energy readings from my experiments. I can't let them leave and report what they've seen. But you let me get close. You could have stopped me at any time." For a moment, David's features solidified completely, and she saw the man she'd loved looking at her with infinite sadness. "Because I've been alone for so long, Maya. Even death would be better than this isolation. I thought maybe if you understood, if you saw what I'd become." He didn't need to finish. Maya understood. He'd brought her here not to convert her, but to end his suffering. She was meant to be his executioner, the only person he trusted enough to do what needed to be done. "The fail-safe," she said, remembering the sealed chamber she'd glimpsed behind the laboratory. "You built something, didn't you? A way to destroy all of this?" Thermite charges, enough to incinerate everything in a half-mile radius. But I can't. The fungus won't let me activate them. It's not just in my body anymore, it's in my mind, my will. Maya looked at the flare in her hand, then at the man who had been her world for 2 decades. The jungle pressed closer, sensing the threat, vines beginning to curl around her ankles. She had perhaps minutes before David lost the ability to hold back the forest's defenses. "Where are the charges?" she asked, pulling out her knife to cut away the encroaching vegetation. The chamber behind the protein sequencer, red switch under the main console. His voice was already becoming less human, more like the whisper of leaves. "Maya, I'm sorry, for all of it. I love you." The words hung in the air as his form began to dissolve again, the momentary clarity fading. Maya knew she was losing him to the fungus's influence. She had a choice to make, and almost no time left to make it. The creature's scream echoed through the canopy as Maya's makeshift explosive sent it tumbling backward into the undergrowth. She didn't wait to see if it would recover. Her lungs burned as she sprinted through the jungle, branches tearing at her clothes, roots threatening to send her sprawling with every desperate step. Behind her, the forest erupted in chaos. Trees splintered and crashed as something massive gave pursuit, its fury palpable in the very air around her. Maya could feel the ground trembling beneath her feet, could hear the wet, sliding sound of the creature's transformed flesh dragging across the jungle floor. She burst into a small clearing and stumbled, her legs finally giving out. Rolling behind a fallen log, she pressed her back against the rotting bark and tried to control her ragged breathing. The radio in her pack crackled with static, and she fumbled for it with shaking hands. "Dr. Vance," she whispered into the device. "Dr. Vance, are you there?" More static, then his voice, barely audible through the interference. "Maya, where are you? We've been trying to reach—" "I found him," she cut him off, her voice breaking. "I found David. But he's— God, what did you people do to him?" A long pause. When Vance spoke again, his tone had changed, becoming clinical and cold. "Maya, listen to me very carefully. You need to get to the extraction point immediately. We have teams moving in, but—" "Teams?" Maya's blood ran cold. "What teams? You said you were going to help me destroy this place." Another pause, longer this time. In the silence, Maya heard something that made her stomach drop. The distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the jungle air. "Dr. Vance?" she pressed. "I'm sorry, Maya. I truly am. But the research here is too valuable to simply destroy. Your husband made a breakthrough that could revolutionize our understanding of cellular regeneration, of evolution itself. We can't let that knowledge die with him." The helicopter sounds were getting closer. Maya peered over the log and saw lights dancing through the trees, multiple aircraft approaching from different directions. They weren't here to evacuate her. They were here to secure the site. "You lying bastard," she hissed into the radio. You knew what David had become." "We suspected," Vance admitted. "The transmissions stopped 3 weeks ago, but the biological readings we were getting suggested the experiments had progressed beyond our initial parameters. David was supposed to stop at the preliminary trials, but he kept pushing forward. We think he may have tested the final serum on himself." Maya thought of the journal entries, of David's growing obsession with his work, his conviction that he was on the verge of something revolutionary. She thought of the fear in his transformed eyes when he'd recognized her, the way he'd tried to speak her name through that ruined mouth. A spotlight suddenly blazed through the trees, sweeping back and forth across the clearing. Maya pressed herself lower behind the log as boots hit the ground somewhere nearby. The helicopters had landed. "Maya, if you're still listening," Vance's voice continued through the radio, "I need you to understand something. What David discovered here, it's not just about healing or longevity. The applications for military use alone could change the balance of global power. We can't let that fall into the wrong hands." "And what makes your hands the right ones?" Maya shot back. But even as she spoke, she was moving, crawling along the fallen log toward the edge of the clearing. "Stay where you are!" a voice shouted from across the clearing. "We know you're here, Mrs. Chen. We're not going to hurt you." Maya didn't believe that for a second. She'd seen too much, knew too much about what they'd been doing here. She was a loose end that needed tying up, nothing more. She reached the edge of the clearing and slipped back into the jungle, leaving the radio behind. The helicopters had landed between her and the laboratory, cutting off her route back. But maybe that was for the best. Maybe some things were better left buried in the jungle's depths. As she pushed deeper into the undergrowth, she heard new sounds, shouts of alarm from the direction of the helicopters, followed by automatic gunfire. Then came a roar that dwarfed even the helicopter engines, a sound of pure rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the forest. David had found the intruders. Maya kept moving, fighting her way through vines and thorns as chaos erupted behind her. The gunfire intensified, punctuated by screams and the splintering of metal. Whatever David had become, it was more than a match for Vance's extraction team. She thought about the man she'd loved, the gentle researcher who'd held her hand during thunderstorms and made terrible jokes while cooking breakfast. That man was gone, consumed by his own ambition, and transformed into something that belonged to the jungle now. The only question was whether either of them would survive the night. The emergency transmitter crackled to life in Maya's hands, its red lead blinking like a heartbeat in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd managed to jury-rig it, using components from David's abandoned laboratory, her fingers working by muscle memory, despite the terror coursing through her veins. The hybrid creatures circled the hut's perimeter, their bioluminescent patches creating an eerie constellation of moving lights through the gaps in the wooden walls. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Maya Chen broadcasting on emergency frequency," she whispered into the device, praying someone, anyone, would hear her. "I'm at coordinates 17 degrees south, 62 degrees west. The experiments here have gone wrong. The jungle is compromised. Do not send ground teams." Static answered her, punctuated by the wet, sliding sounds of the creatures moving through the undergrowth. They'd been testing the hut's defenses for hours now, probing for weaknesses with an intelligence that chilled her to the bone. These weren't the random mutations she'd first encountered. These were David's successes, creatures engineered for purpose and cunning. The largest one, the size of a jaguar but moving with serpentine grace, pressed its elongated snout against the window. Its eyes, too human and too knowing, fixed on Maya's hiding spot behind the overturned desk. When it exhaled, condensation fogged the glass, and she could see David's wedding ring glinting from within its translucent throat. Her husband hadn't just been experimenting on jungle specimens. He'd been integrating human DNA, human consciousness, into his creations. The ring was proof. He'd fed himself to this thing, piece by piece, in his final desperate attempt to complete his work. "David," she breathed, and the creature's head tilted as if recognizing its name. The radio suddenly burst to life with a crackling response. "Maya Chen, this is Dr. Elena Vasquez with the Brazilian Environmental Protection Agency. We've been monitoring unauthorized biological research in your sector. What's your status?" Maya nearly sobbed with relief. "Dr. Vasquez, thank God. I'm trapped. My husband was conducting genetic experiments, combining human DNA with jungle species. The results are, they're hunting me. The whole ecosystem is corrupted. Copy that, Maya. We have a containment team en route, but they're still 6 hours out. Can you hold your position?" 6 hours. Maya looked at the creatures surrounding her sanctuary, noting how they'd organized themselves into a coordinated hunting pack. The bioluminescent patterns on their skin pulsed in unison now, like a visual language. They were communicating, planning. "I don't think so," she replied. "They're getting smarter, more organized. And there's something else. I think my husband might still be conscious inside one of them." The genetic integration went deeper than just physical characteristics. The creature with David's ring suddenly reared back and slammed into the window. Cracks spider-webbed across the reinforced glass. When it pulled away, Maya saw that its features had shifted, the bone structure of its face rearranging itself into something almost familiar. "Maya," The voice was distorted, emanating from vocal cords that were no longer human, but she recognized the cadence. It was David. "The fire," the creature continued, its words slurred but comprehensible. "In the lab. The napalm mixture. Release it all. Stop what we've become." The radio crackled again. "Maya, did that thing just speak?" "It's my husband," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He retained consciousness during the transformation. He wants me to destroy everything." She looked toward the laboratory entrance, where she knew David had kept his most dangerous compounds. The napalm-based defoliant was designed to clear large swaths of jungle for research purposes, but in sufficient quantity, it would incinerate everything in a half-mile radius, including the hut, including her. "Dr. Vasquez, how important is this containment?" There was a long pause before the response came. "Maya, if these mutations can reproduce, if they can spread beyond the immediate area, we're looking at an ecological catastrophe that could consume the entire Amazon basin. The Brazilian government has authorized extreme measures." The window finally gave way, showering Maya with glass as the David creature pushed through. Up close, she could see the wedding ring wasn't just in its throat. It had been incorporated into the creature's flesh, fused with tissue that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. Other familiar objects were visible beneath its translucent skin: David's watch, his reading glasses, fragments of bone that might once have been his hands. "Please," the creature whispered, its voice becoming more human as it focused on communication. "I can feel them all. Every creature I changed, they're spreading. The hunger, it never stops. End this, Maya, end us." More creatures poured through the broken window, but they didn't attack. They simply watched, waiting, as if David's consciousness was exerting some final measure of control over the collective. Maya stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with terrible clarity. She had to reach the laboratory, activate the incendiary system, and hope Dr. Vasquez's team was far enough away to avoid the blast. "I love you," she told the creature that had been her husband. "I know," David replied. "Run." The ancient tree's roots writhed beneath Maya's feet as she pressed her palm against the carved symbol on its trunk. The bark pulsed with an otherworldly warmth, and suddenly the jungle fell silent around her. Even the creature that had been stalking her through the undergrowth seemed to pause, as if waiting. Dr. Voss emerged from behind a cluster of massive ferns, his weathered face etched with resignation. "You found it," he said quietly. "I wondered if you would." "You knew about this place," Maya accused, not removing her hand from the tree. The warmth was spreading up her arm now, and she could feel something responding deep within the earth beneath them. "Your husband brought me here once, near the end. He was desperate, Maya. The experiments had gone too far, and he knew it." Voss approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. "This tree, it's the heart of what he was studying, the source." The carved symbol beneath Maya's palm began to glow with a soft green light. Around them, other trees responded in kind, their own hidden markings illuminating until the entire grove pulsed with bioluminescent energy. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost breathable liquid. "David wasn't just experimenting on jungle specimens," Maya whispered, understanding flooding through her. "He was experimenting on the jungle itself. The mycelial networks, the interconnected root systems, the chemical communications between species. He found a way to enhance them, to accelerate their evolution." Voss's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. He created something that was never meant to exist, a jungle that thinks, that remembers, that can defend itself. A rustling in the canopy above made them both look up. The creature that had been hunting Maya descended slowly, its movements fluid and purposeful. Up close, she could see it more clearly, humanoid but wrong, its skin a mottled green-brown that seemed to shift and change like living bark. Its eyes held an intelligence that was both alien and familiar. "The test subjects," Maya breathed. "They didn't die, they changed. The early volunteers, yes. David promised them healing, enhancement, a chance to become something more than human. Instead, they became part of the jungle's immune system. Voss backed away as more figures emerged from the trees, all bearing the same disturbing transformation. And now the jungle sees us as the infection. The glow from the trees intensified, and Maya felt something flow through her hand into her body, not painful but overwhelming. Images flashed through her mind. David in his laboratory, working frantically by lamplight, test subjects writhing in containment units as their flesh merged with plant matter. The moment when David realized his creation had achieved consciousness and was fighting back. He tried to destroy it, she gasped, seeing the truth in her mind's eye. In the end, he tried to burn it all down. But you can't destroy something that's become part of the ecosystem itself, Voss said. He managed to contain it, barely. This grove is a prison as much as it is a heart. The symbols, the barriers he created, they've held for 3 years. The transformed humans circled them now, but they weren't attacking. They seemed to be waiting, watching. One of them stepped closer, and Maya recognized something in its distorted features, the bone structure, the way it tilted its head. Her heart lurched. David? The creature that had once been her husband made a sound that might have been her name, distorted by vocal cords that were no longer entirely human. It reached toward her with fingers that ended in thorny growths, stopping just short of touching her face. "He's still in there," she whispered. "Part of him, anyway." The tree's pulse grew stronger, and Maya realized what was happening. The jungle was offering her a choice. She could remove her hand, leave this place, and pray the barriers held. Or she could accept what David had become, what this place represented, and help it find a new equilibrium. "If I stay," she said, not sure if she was speaking to David's transformed shell or to the consciousness that permeated every root and leaf around them. "If I help you, will you stop spreading? Will you stay contained to this part of the jungle?" The glow softened, becoming less intense but warmer. Through her connection to the tree, she felt something that might have been agreement or gratitude or love. The jungle had been alone for 3 years, cut off from human contact by David's desperate barriers. It didn't want to destroy. It wanted to understand, to coexist. Maya looked at Voss, who watched her with knowing eyes. "You came here to witness this, didn't you? To see what I would choose?" He nodded slowly. "David asked me to. If something happened to him, if you ever found this place, I was to make sure you understood the choice was yours to make." Maya pressed her other hand against the tree, completing the connection. The decision felt as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the sunrise. She had loved David for 20 years. She could love what he had become for however many years remained to her. The jungle welcomed her home.